this is everyone, so that's great. So I'm Andy Challoner, Professor of Climate Impacts, and I'm the PI on the kind of modelling side of AfriCap and the iFEED work that Stuart presented. So welcome everyone to the breakout session. And what I'm going to do is, rather than share slides, I'm going to send you a link for a poster which you can have a look at. You can either have a look at this while I speak and explore the different bits. I know a lot of people have got used to doing that, multitasking while we're listening to people. So rather than being a slave to my pace of going through slides, just feel free to have a click through these, but I'll maybe use some of them as I introduce iFEED. And then we do have a few slides after that with a little bit more detail. And I think, you know, at any point, please just raise your hands for comments and questions, and particularly as the session goes on, but certainly at any point. But as the session goes on, I think it would be really useful to do that and to hear your perspectives on this as well as ours. So, so the thing that really kind of excites me about this approach, iFEED, and the broader approach of integrated assessment frameworks, is the bringing together of models with expert judgment, with in-country expertise and in-country task forces. And actually, you can think beyond Africa for this. So I won't say anything else to sort of introduce the African context. In some ways, it's a more acute version of the nice introduction from Steve at the start, outlining the kind of scale of the problem in terms of growing population and double burden of disease and etc. So I won't say much more about that bigger picture, but just a little bit more about the various elements of iFEED. If you click in the top left panel of the poster, you'll see our kind of overall approach and the schematic, which I think actually is also in Stuart's presentation. So that's the overall approach of these participatory scenario workshops that lead into modelling, that lead into these calibrated statements and implication statements. So this is at the heart of iFEED, to translate model results into just simple, but actually also slightly technical, because it has to communicate well the level of certainty of the statements that are coming out of the modelling. And the idea is these statements become kind of increasingly relevant to the problem, and in a way increasingly distant from the models, but they retain the kind of core of insight that the model contains. So we've crafted the team have crafted, some 100 plus, I think, of these type of statements, probably hundreds, applying to different elements of the problem. So that's really the heart of what we're doing. And then the components you can see on the bottom left: land use and emissions. So this, the various land use configurations that are possible for food production are our kind of way into setting up along with the participatory scenario workshops, are our way into setting up the modelling work. So the participatory scenario workshops tell us what the stakeholders care about. Is it land reform? Is it the extent of climate change? And the land use and emissions part of the work sets up, well, exactly what are the land use configurations that embody those stakeholder interests, essentially. You can see a panel on task forces, people power task forces and integration workshops on the centre left. And in the top right, there's a panel on climate-induced changes to crop productivity. So this has been my kind of bread and butter, and my group's bread and butter over the years, applying and developing crop models to use with climate models to say things about future impacts, about uncertainties associated with that, about how to adapt with that at different scales, national, subnational, global. And that can feed into a whole range of different approaches and work, but the focus here really is on the policies and feeding into policies. So the centre left column, if you look at that column, I'm not going to talk about these details, and you can look at these kind of panels afterwards or ask questions as we go. So the idea is that this system feeds into drawing out the best from these crop climate models and the trade and nutrition part, which I'll talk about in a sec, into what this means for policy, and having conversations with stakeholders through the task forces throughout the process, and a summary process that really produces information that's relevant to policy. This poster, I should say, is quite old now. It's probably nearing on a year, but I thought it was a good way of giving an overview, giving you something to look at, whilst also giving a softer kind of introduction, if you like, to the topic. The final box on the bottom right is trade and nutrition outcomes, and this is one of the and I can say this clearly because it's not my work. A really exciting innovation to come out of this is looking at how trade and nutrition outcomes are interrelated. It's the pattern of domestic production together with international trade, essentially, that determines at a country level what the nutrition outcomes are. Is the right mix of food being grown / imported? What's the end result of all of that? And there's some really innovative work looking at that and looking at what those look like under different climate scenarios. But again, this is a very broad general introduction, so I'm not going to go into much detail on that. We're already, this approach is already making its way into, I think the current count is four live proposals. So I'm sure there's future life in these ideas yet, but we're very open to hearing about and discussing with you other ways that might be possible, and how we might join up, even more broadly than what we're doing at the moment. So maybe at this point, before Stuart shows a few more slides, I'll just leave a pause in case of any questions and comments. And I'll just, again, encourage you to raise your hands and chip in with thoughts as we go along, including as Stuart's speaking. I'll keep my eyes on the virtual or indeed physical hands, though virtual might be easier once Stuart has started presenting. So Stuart, if you're ready with your slides, then go ahead.
Sure, I would just prove the point that in virtual meetings you can't escape from PowerPoint for too long by sharing my screen. So hopefully everyone can now see the slides okay, although that's the wrong one.
Yes, we can.
Great. So yeah, I won't spend long obviously explaining this diagram yet again for everyone, but today I'll just talk through some results from South Africa as an example, highlighting some of the areas that Andy's already talked through with the context of South Africa in particular. So as we've heard, the first stage in the iFEED process are scenario workshops where each country has stakeholders that suggest narratives of change that iFEED seeks to represent. And in South Africa, the two factors that were decided to be most important by stakeholders were the extent of climate change risk, which were represented using RCP 2.6 and RCP 8.5, and the extent of land reform. And this essentially is about an equitable redistribution of land away from the predominantly white farmers who own, at least currently and in the past, the majority of the agricultural land in South Africa. So following this initial definition of the scenario narratives, further inputs are then given by stakeholders to decide exactly how those scenarios should be represented in the modelling. And these inputs are, for example, suggestions whether agricultural land should increase or decrease, should irrigation increase, how should crop diversification change, and how should, say, food trade change, so imports and exports, whether they should increase or decrease in each scenario.
Stuart, we've got a great comment in the chat from Guy Ziv about essentially the bounds of these boundaries of these changes, how we chose the maxima and minima. So he's asking what are the barriers to a 400% increase in production. And so if you could say something about how we determine those boundaries, I think that will answer that question. And Guy, just chip in vocally after Stuart, if not, or with any follow-up comment.
Sure, yeah, it's a really interesting question. So I think first and foremost, if stakeholders suggested a certain increase or decrease, that's what we went with. So there are some examples that, say, here in South Africa, they suggested that agricultural land would, say, go down by 10% or increase by 10%. If stakeholders didn't give specific recommendations on certain bounds, say about agricultural land, we then relied on what we considered kind of plausible upper limits in each case. So An example would be if stakeholders merely just suggested that agricultural land would increase, but didn't give a specific recommendation about how large that increase should be. In consultation with the stakeholders and in agreement with them, we then suggested that agricultural land would increase to use up as much as possible without, for example, using protected areas or currently forested areas. So we just, again, in consultation with the stakeholders, just suggested that this is a sensible way forward for a plausible kind of increased agricultural land future. So that's the agricultural area. There are various other factors we could talk about, such as irrigation, diversification, yields, but we might come on to that later in the presentation. I hope that kind of gives a general idea of one of the factors that varies in iFEED and an example of that. If that's okay, I'll move on to start talking about some of the results. But again, anyone feel free to ask any questions anytime. So yeah, in many ways, the first stage of the modelling is the modelling of food production. So we can see some results from this process here for the different scenarios. So on the left-hand plot, we have little land reform, which is one of those two scenario defining factors. And on the right, we have significant land reform. And as I said, low and high climate risk are defined by RCP 2.6 and RCP 8.5. So the first thing to note here is that food production is increasing. And that's primarily due to, again, one of those assumptions agreed with stakeholders, in that technology was assumed to be a sort of middling scenario here, and that we looked at historical crop yield trends, and for South Africa assumed that half of the historical trend would continue to be applied into the future, which is why you can see some fairly significant production increases here, production being the result of area change and yield changes. The other things to note from the food production results are that, as you can see highlighted in the green circles here, comparing crop production change from 2000 to 2050 for both low and high climate risk, you can see perhaps counterintuitively that for high climate risk, production of crops and livestock increases more. And this again comes down to the assumptions agreed with stakeholders. The main assumption here was that in the face of high climate risk, actions and policies would be undertaken that mitigate against that risk, particularly thinking here, for example, about crop diversification and irrigation. So when you take action to do that, crop production in average terms, in terms of average changes between the baseline and the future, can be shown to increase. The other main thing to take from this is comparing the little land reform and significant land reform scenarios. And you can see with significant land reform, there's slightly less of a production increase, comparing the two red circles here. And this is because, again, due to the assumptions agreed with the stakeholders, where in the significant land reform scenarios, it was assumed that arable crop areas would slightly decrease compared to the little land reform futures. So this is really, as I said, the first stage in the modelling process. And as Andy pointed out, one of the main exciting things about the results are the trade and nutrition outcomes that follow on from the projections of food production. And you can see an example of this in the figure here. So this is an example from the low land reform and high climate risk scenario. Each row is a nutrient requirement. The first row, for example, shows energy, so calories. So it's a way of judging whether food security is achieved. Then each subsequent row is a micronutrient requirement. The green areas in the figure for each row show where population level requirements are met, and the red areas show where they're not met. The black diamonds you can see are the historical, where we are present day, and the coloured diamonds show projections for 2050 for each micronutrient. So the main thing to take away from this is that for all the scenarios, and as you can see in this example here, in the first row, food security is achieved in that there's sufficient calories in the diet. However, as you can see in the highlighted circle there are some micronutrients where that's not the case. For example, calcium and iron are still slightly deficient, even though they're slightly improved in the baseline compared to the baseline. So what we can, to summarize, food security in many ways is achieved, but nutrition security in certain areas is not achieved. And this, for example, could have massive trade implications. I forgot to say that this figure assumes trade stays business as usual. So we can think about ways where these micronutrient requirements might be met in future, and that could come from changes to trade as well as possible changes to domestic food production. And with perhaps calcium and iron in mind in particular, that could have implications for possible increases to livestock production domestically, which could be desirable to achieve nutrition security. However, as we'll all know, that will have massive implications, for example, for emissions. And that's another area we've looked at with the modelling and iFEED. So we examined what emissions were like in each scenario. And in the case of South Africa, greenhouse gas emissions actually increased by about 50% in all 4 scenarios. But of course, if we're then talking about increasing livestock production, for example, in order to achieve nutrition security, that could have really big implications for greenhouse gas emissions, to name one factor. So the previous results I've talked about for food production and nutrition security focus on average changes to production and the projections resulting from that. But we've also in iFEED looked at climate change and extremes and the resulting impacts of these. So the present day climate is capable of unprecedented levels of extremes that we've not seen currently, but we can look at a detailed set of model simulations to understand what could happen based on the current climate. And it's important to understand that firstly in terms of what impacts there could be before we then look at climate change impacts. And we've estimated the annual likelihood of changes in the January to March period for a key growing area for maize in South Africa. And the results of that are in the table here. But to give an example, there's about a 1% chance of record-breaking rainfall events happening in the current climate. And this, of course, could have large implications for maize production. Climate change is also going to result in, of course, warming, and that could have implications for extremes as well. So you can see in the figure here on the right, changes to days per month above 35 degrees Celsius. Changes in rainfall amounts are less certain in terms of model projections, but in general, the tendency is again towards greater extremes of rainfall. We've also looked at crop failure. So with these probable increases of climate extremes, we can also say something about what the likely impacts of crop yields are going to be in not just an average change from 2000 to 2050, but in what could be a particularly bad year and how the effects could be different in between 2000 and 2050. And the figure you can see here shows different changes to crop failure rates. Crop failures here are defined as 1.5 standard deviations below the historical mean. And the figure shows this for maize and soybean for, again, low and high climate risk being RCP 2.6 and RCP 8.5. And as you can see, approximately crop failure rates are projected to double for key crops such as maize, soybean, and potato. So this, of course, could have massive implications, whereas our average projections could show that there might be a trend to increasing production if we can successfully adapt to climate change. But that doesn't mean that there couldn't be some significant supply issues if in, say, many countries simultaneously, crop failures are becoming more common. So this could, for example, have implications for trade and perhaps in certain bad years relying on trade more. So just to summarize then these results I've talked through before I hand back to Andy, there's increased occurrence and frequency of temperature extremes in the 2050s under both high and low climate risk and a slight trend towards longer extreme dry spells and shorter extreme wet spells during the October to April period. Irrigation, drought-resistant varieties and varieties that keep pace with warming are all key to maintaining and perhaps increasing crop yields and food production in South Africa. Climate change preparedness in the face of high climate risk could marginally improve nutrition security, but it's not sufficient to mitigate against all nutrient deficiencies as we've seen. And this points to the importance of linking agricultural policy, trade policy and health and nutrition policy, as well as focusing not just on calories, i.e. food security, but nutrition security as well. And commodity crop failure rates likely imply greater reliance on trade or perhaps a switch to other crops if temperature and drought resistance are limited. And with that, I think I'll hand back to you, Andy, for a discussion of next steps for iFEED.
Sorry, the old non-muted trick. Thanks, I think we're all right now. You're still in control of the slide, right? So I think you can just skip on. And so, you know, again, do raise hands. Encourage you to turn cameras on as well for discussion. I've got just a handful of slides more, and then it really will be open discussion. So we'll have plenty of time for that, which is good. So Stuart mentioned that the portal is now online after a non-zero amount of toing and froing with IT. Perhaps the less said about that, the better. But it is now online, which is great. So this is where you can get at the underlying results and plot out the underlying results. I don't know if that part of it is fully live yet, but this is where the summarized document and results and the calibration statements, etc., will all be housed. So I think that's a good resource for future research, for digging in deeper, and actually, you know, even for well, I've already got someone, we've got a couple of people, I think, looking at these data for masters projects. So that's another interesting avenue potentially. So thanks, Stuart. Okay, so I said the first bullet. So we've got the 4 AfriCAP countries that you can really dive into with the data that are there. But actually, we see iFEED and integrated assessments more broadly as a flexible approach to apply to related questions in any area of the globe. And it lends itself to problems that can be partially modelled with results and stakeholder engagement, kind of enabling that broader expertise base. So essentially, it's a way of being a little bit more formal and structured in the way that model results are gradually handed over to a broader team, whilst the model team still remain involved. So one of the things I've really enjoyed about the process has been exactly that we focus on our usual modeling. We love models, tinkering around with models, producing results, but actually just letting go of that process over time and allowing other people to talk about iFEED, to develop it, and to kind of take that co-ownership of it. Thanks, Stuart. One of this, I've kind of thrown this in there as another way of something that I'm interested in applying iFEED to in the climate change context, is that we can think about climate change as a kind of signal to noise problem, really. So the noise is current climate, the grey sort of baseline here of no temperature anomaly, and climate change is this red signal that over time emerges from the kind of noise of background climate variability. And we've done a little bit of work, not so much using the iFEED approach, but looking at using this signal to noise type approach to ask, instead of projecting, as is often the case with climate change impacts and adaptation, what's going to happen in the 2050s, what's going to happen maybe at the end of the century, temperatures are going to be in this range, yield impacts are going to be in this range with these possible implications. Instead of doing that, we say, okay, when is this signal going to emerge from the noise? When is this climate signal going to emerge from background noise? But this becomes, I think, even more interesting when we say, when is the signal of climate on crops going to emerge from background noise? And we've done some work on that, looking at the implications of breeding for crop breeding. But what I think would be really interesting is to say, when does the signal of, fill in your blank here according to the area you work on, but again, it's this question of what can we model and what can't we model? So we could think about food security impacts, even at kind of aggregate levels across a city, or almost any problem. You might have a lot of noise in your question, and it might be that the answer is we can't separate the signal from the noise. But there must be some problems out there where we can really take it down to that impact at the end of the problem and the adaptations needed, and ask that question of when are these problems going to emerge? And actually, you could apply this not just to climate change. You could think about the multiple disruptions that we're seeing due to we've had COVID and Brexit, supply chain disruptions, and actually often they dominate. But actually, this could be a framework for integrating all of these different influences and asking the question, when will this signal emerge from the noise? I'm just reading a comment from, maybe I won't try and read the comment from Guy as we go, but Guy, if you want to chip in, just chip in, or we can come back to that.
Can I ask, because it is about this single, if a scientist, we say, well, we say that emergencies where there is less than 5% chance to see what we are seeing now under like the current climate, sort of like a null model, like H0 hypothesis. That would be what scientists will say, it's a good statistical test, but maybe that would be too late for action, for policy to actually do anything about it. By the time we reach that point where the scientists, we can say, something has emerged from the noise.
Yeah, it's a good question. Actually, I'm really applying this framework to a kind of this idea to an impacts framework, an adaptation framework, to say how can we adapt. But you're absolutely right. This actually doesn't address the mitigation problem, and it may not give time for mitigation. This assumes that that we kind of keep an eye on this, and that the change is sufficiently slow that something can be done. In fact, whether that change is too slow or too quick, unsurprisingly, depends on the background state, depends on current policies. So in the breeding work I mentioned, we looked in Africa and said, well, how long does it take to do the pre-breeding, to do the breeding, to develop new varieties, to get them out there in the field? And the answer is, 20, 30 years. And so the answer there is, well, actually, we're not keeping pace with climate change, and what we need to do is shorten that time for breeding, development, and adoption of new crops. In the north, this is less of a problem. The turnaround is quicker. So, again, there's that differentiation. But so those are different ways of looking at it. But I've not really looked at the mitigation side of it. And you're right, some of this could come too late for that. More broadly speaking, Fiona, maybe policy is part of the noise. Well, I tend to assume policy is nice and clean. I think maybe people, which I know it isn't, but I think this is a trap most of us in research fall into. We say, oh, there are many uncertainties involved in my research, and I'm sure other people's, we implicitly think, is kind of cleaner. I can see some good discussion on there, so I'll let that carry on just while I finish the slides, but we can return, because we will have time to return to these questions. I'm not sure how many more slides I have, actually. Stuart, can you hit the button and see what's next? So this is a case study which we highlighted in UK climate change risk assessment of salad shortage in 2017. What were the drivers, what were the impacts, and what were the responses? In this case, it was a climate event, flooding in southeast Spain, cold temperatures in Italy. They produced shortages. They directly damaged crops, but they also damaged the actual supply chain routes. And this was a period where we were having trouble getting salad and other similar things from supermarkets, and that was simply because of where our supplies is sourced. So this question of diversity of supply chains is important. And these risks emerge when the current biophysical socioeconomic systems are stressed in new ways. And actually, COVID is probably an equally good or better example of this. So I'm sure many of us are aware of those issues, and it would be really good to look at these supply chain issues through this framework. Stuart, thanks. So I don't want to say too much more about this. Climate change, the UK Climate Change Risk Assessment 3 is out. I led together with Tim Benton on Chapter 7. This is our overall framework for that, and the showing how there's a whole range of impacts and transmission mechanisms. So this isn't just food now. Energy, finance and markets, governance, well-being, you can read the list. And we looked at the ways in which the background sort of states, there can be a socioeconomic amplification of these risks as they move across borders and indeed across sectors. I don't want to take us too far off topic, so I think that will do for that. And that might be, is that more or less it, Stuart?
There are a couple more slides, I think. Yeah,
let's look at them anyway, but I think we might come back to this this kind of emergence mitigation supply chain question. Oh yeah, so this is one on just going back to the details of the calibrated statements and implication statements that are at the heart of iFEED, and I know I've spoken about already, but I wanted to show some examples of how we can translate these model results into clear statements. And Stuart and I had a virtual meeting, kind of going back and forth with the wording of these and getting these wordings according to, we followed the IPCC system where they assess the degree of confidence in results based on agreement with the scientific literature. Are you saying something radically different to someone else? If so, maybe you have less confidence at the moment until and unless your view becomes consensus. And then also on the degree of robustness within the model. So we look outwards at the literature and we look inwards at the model results and say, taking account of all the uncertainties, how robust is this result? Are all our model projections saying the same thing, or is it just some of them? So this example statement that you can read: without adaptation, climate change means that you get mean yields decreasing, and there's some further details about which crops, etc. And then the implication statements that the broader team then use that statement to build upon were to do with how the reduction in yield for cash crops would then lead to income loss, undermine household resilience, and increase financial vulnerability. And you can read the other two there. So this is just a little insight into what's at the heart of the system. And this is what I would like to apply in different situations, keeping that model rigor, but having clear conversations with people who actually, don't know how models are run and maybe even don't want to know and wouldn't know how to interpret models, but it's that sort of translation tool, if you like, at the heart of it. Are there any more, Stuart? Or are we into open discussion? Oh, yeah, you can look at that for a sec. The way in which these millions of model results come towards these hundreds of calibrated statements, together with hundreds of implication statements, to produce the policy documents, which aren't quite ready yet. But we've been having a lot of discussions with policy makers along the way, and those 3 bullets on the right give examples of how FANRAPAN have helped us, our partners have helped us to have these policy dialogues during the AFRICAP process. That must be it now, Stuart, is it?
Just the discussion.
Discussion, just the discussion. Let's kill the slides and then add. Okay, not yet. These are just ideas. Looking at iFEED in different regions, using this approach in other contexts. You can read the others, perhaps they're less interesting, or perhaps they're not. But I think we've got some good discussion to come back to, and I can feel some good discussion coming. So maybe, Stuart, let's just kill the slides at this point and encourage those with cameras off to turn them on if they can and if they want to. And I'm going to open the floor completely to discussion while I maybe read some of the comments that are there, but people who've commented, just feel free to just dive in and kind of read those comments out almost, and we can just have some good discussion for the next sort of 15-20 minutes. Fiona, please.
Hi, thanks to you both. It was really, really fascinating. And as you know, we've had a chat about using this in the soy project. What I'm really interested in is what happens after the policy recommendations, because as somebody involved in, if you like, delivery of policy, I've got a very different idea of what that word policy means. So for me, there's a differentiation between what governments do and their ambition, which I would call policy, and then the implementation of those policies through particular, I don't know, standards or changes in rules. And what I'm really interested in is there any space in the model for maybe if you've got different kinds of legal instruments like a standard, can you feed it back into the model? Is that any part of the model, or does it just stop once the policy is generated?
What a great idea. Why wait until the results are there, actually? Why not build those specific instruments into the model framework and say, we are going to use these are the ways in which these policies are going to be implemented. So we're bringing those into the system at the start to say that these are ultimately the agents of change. And that could happen through the stakeholder engagement at the start. And so that, again, right from the start, we're saying, what are your problems? What are your current solutions or possible solutions? What are these policy instruments that exist? How are they doing so far? What are their pros and cons? Have some conversations and let that directly influence the model framework.
Yeah,
that'd be really cool.
Yeah, just and a quick follow-up point on that, and then I'll leave it to everybody else. And one of the interesting things for me is all of this activity that's feeding into the model at the minute is already grounded in a legal framework of some kind or another. So it's actually part of the problem. And so I think having that, as you know, I've shared this idea that in my view, the regulation side is as much part of the problem as all the climate impacts and all the other things. And I think recognizing that is just brilliant. So thanks so much for your work on this. It's brilliant. I'll hand over to everybody else.
What a great idea, Fiona. We've got to do that. We've got to do that. Let's do it. Guy, I can see you've got your hand up.
Thanks, Andy. I was just wondering, I really like your framework. Does it really have to be starting with models? I mean, can it start with just less things like meta-analysis and empirical data? Is the modeling, you say, a critical component of this framework?
I think I'm glad you. I am glad you asked. So, in fact, we filled in some. Well, first of all, we filled in some gaps in our model capability with a very simple modeling approach. That's the first thing to say. So, you know, do we need the really detailed models always? Maybe, maybe not. But also in looking at our level of agreement with literature. So that second part of that kind of level of certainty that we were applying to the results, the IPCC method. We looked, essentially, we used meta-analysis that I'd conducted a few years ago for the IPCC exams, and said, well, are our model results vastly different from what others have said? And, you know, if where they weren't, we said, well, we've got high agreement. So this was fed into this idea that we've got high agreement. So I suspect that we don't always need to start with the models and to have these model results. But the problem is, how do we know when that's the case and when it isn't the case? And so maybe our model results in some situation produce some results that are radically different or different to what others have done. But perhaps there's a good reason for that, because we've put something into the model that others haven't. So we have a legitimate reason to disagree with the consensus. So the trick would be to identify that. So that would be ideally, there would be a pre-stage here saying, where do these models need to be? Which models need to be applied and where can we just rely on the literature? And probably, you know, frankly, with AfriCap, we didn't start with that simply because we took the modeling as a starting point. And I think the next step would actually be to do something similar to what you're describing, but to ask that question, where are models needed and where aren't they needed? So great question, thank you. More comments, questions. I'm behind on the chat. If anyone wants to chip in with something from the chat or something from the chat that sparks the thought in them, then please do. I'll try and scan while I'm keeping my eyes out for hands.
I'd made a comment. I feel like it's a little bit unfair to ask specific people, but I'd ask Chi and Ann in the chat their points about market and supply chain, various mechanisms through market and supply chain pressures that will drive decisions, and sort of where and how you get value for various stakeholders, households, consumers, if it's not solely subsistence, and so on. And I thought those were really important, because that sort of brings in some of the power relationships that and how those come to play in shaping decisions, whether, you know, let's say beneficial outcomes scale up, or whether they get left behind for less, you know, what we might consider through your analysis, less beneficial outcomes.
May I just explain a bit more? My question is more about how we see land use and land reform. While the governments, some African governments, take the decisions on how the lands are being used, including giving the Chinese land to, you know, to plant whatever they want to. So there have been a lot of controversies in terms of letting, well, the Chinese or the market use the land. And that actually, of course, is a problem, because they might not really want to care about the environment or the African people, and they want to, you know, get as much money out as possible. There have been controversies about what the intentions of Chinese coming to Africans, Malawi, Zimbabwe, all these countries for. Now, on paper, it's a bit like, okay, let's let Chinese transfer technology to the African farmers, but is it, you know, is it affecting the diversifications that we think it should be, and so on? There are a lot of questions in here that perhaps we need to consider.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, I can say a little bit about that with an example from Tanzania. I mean, regarding land use in general, as I was saying, we're very much driven by the stakeholder input. And the other thing to say about this is we're very reliant on the scenarios framework. So in order to sort of answer the sorts of questions, really important questions you're raising, we need to effectively contrast the different scenarios. So for example, in Tanzania, stakeholder input suggested for one of the high technology scenarios we modeled in Tanzania, that monoculture would increase. And in the other high technology scenario, there'd be more crop diversification. So we can then use the outcome of the process to make inferences about policy outcomes based on these contrasting scenarios. But one of the interesting things we've talked about is it would be nice to almost revisit the scenarios we've modeled, in some cases to almost look at just extra scenarios, because both from a sort of modeling perspective, but also from right back to the stakeholder workshops at the start of the project, people were, as soon as the scenarios were defined, people were naturally like, I think this is important, this should be included. And there's just endless things that people want to look at. But that's the good thing about scenarios framework, in that ideally you have as contrasting possible futures as possible, so you can map out sensible kind of policy space.
Can I ask you about the scenarios? I'm just wondering, you keep saying stakeholders as, you know, as if it is a homogeneous group, but in reality, you know, farmers, land managers, advisors, NGOs, national agencies, they might have completely different views. And so when you had those workshops, how did you collate the different viewpoints of different stakeholder groups, and how did you find a way of combining them?
Yeah, it's another really important question. So basically, we relied on our in-country partner organizations to primarily gather the stakeholders in the room, and they did range from, in most cases, representatives of farmers' unions all the way, you could say, up to agricultural ministry representatives. So there were a very kind of broad range of actors in the room. One thing I've thought for a while, though, is that because these stakeholder workshops were only one day long per country and they had such an important influence on the project, it would be great to almost just as simply as taking longer and having longer time to talk about these issues. Because obviously there are lots of people in the room, and it's always going to be difficult, I think, to gather everyone's perspectives on this. But the short answer is that we essentially try to do as best we can and have as many different people in the room in the time we had, I think.
Yeah, good answer, Stuart. And it was challenging. It's the first time I'd tried to do that. And you know, I'm aware, and I think this speaks to Anne's comment in the chat, you know, I'm aware that it was, this policy dialogue was, you know, not, well, in some ways it was straightforward, but to do that in an inclusive way, you know, I was subtly aware of the different power dynamics, the different the fact that it was virtual, you know, helped in some ways, but also didn't in others. And so I think we could do more, actually, particularly with the right people involved, to facilitate those discussions to get the best out of it. Because, you know, to give an example, you know, at the start of the project, we asked, I mean, I wasn't at these workshops, but in the participatory scenario workshops, we asked, what are the dimensions of future change that are most important for you as stakeholders in the work that we're doing? And climate risk, climate change emerged, you know, from all 4 countries. They all said that's important, and they all had a second axis. Now, if we weren't coming in as a project, you know, about climate change, you know, sustainability, developing future pathways, what would have come out of that? Would climate change have come out as important in each case? Possibly, but actually, it's that kind of staying open to what comes out and being responsive to that. You know, and there may be boundaries to that. You know, it may be that ultimately you might say, well, we can change what we're doing by so much, but actually we're not the right people to do precisely what's coming out of this. So I think this is another area I'd like to develop in the future, to have those policy dialogues in as just an open, a constructive and fair way as possible, to really work on that element. I think would be good.
I just want to add this. I was looking at the case of the countries where the studies were carried out, and I seem to discover that the focus is more on the Southern Africa. But within the African context, there are different the Africa, we may be all in sub-Saharan Africa, but we have different local challenges. And my organization, Sustainable Environment, in partnership with Norwich Scotland, I think we did a similar dialogue for stakeholders group consisting of farmers, people from the ministry, and all other stakeholders group on food system for Nigeria, to be precise. So I just want to ask, maybe in future, if you have something, because the Southern African scenario is quite different from the West African perspective. So maybe in future, if there could be something, or even if the model could be fit into some of the works that we do, I just want to know. Thank you.
Great, Abiodun, thank you for that. And we gave the South African example, but this work is being conducted for Tanzania, for Malawi, and for Zambia. Also, we're looking to expand it to Kenya through a project proposal with deadlines very soon, which we're hoping would start next year. So this is a very active area of research, and we do think it's something that can be translated to other regions, most simply and most easily, actually, Africa, but also beyond. So thank you for raising that. Any other comments, questions, areas for discussion? Steve is unmuted. Go.
Yeah, no, I was just I really like the points that the discussion that followed up on this from Anne and from Guy around who's in the room, who has voice, power relationships come out, and the stakeholders and those which either aren't represented or are silenced by the process. That's really interesting. And I think, to my mind, mainly not because of expert knowledge, but because of collaboration, friendships with academics and their partners in a range of African institutions, my guess is that there's a very big gender component of what would come out of stakeholder engagement. And it's well out of my comfort zone about how you address these aspects, but it's something that I think is, I'm guessing, almost just from informal relationships, that this is probably very, very important. Yeah,
that's a really good point. And in one of the follow-up proposals, which is to the CGIAR, and the CGIAR have been increasingly aware of the importance of gender and fairness across a number of dimensions. Actually, we're kind of building that in, but we're at the moment, we've not really dived into how we do that, but we have a cross-cutting theme on gender inequality that we're building into it. I think that part of it won't happen until the rest of the project, if we're funded, is up and running, I suspect. And I think this stuff is a lot harder to do than it is to talk about, but talking about it is an obvious and important start. So yeah, thanks. Anyone else got any comments or questions? We're probably at about time, actually, although I know we're ahead of time schedule-wise. So I think the next session starts in 20 minutes, and I think we were 15 minutes ahead of schedule. So let me just keep my eyes peeled for hands as Guy, please.
So I'm just wondering, when you talk about how this research will impact policy, what policy do you actually think about? I'm more familiar with European policy, so we talk about the common agricultural policy, now the UK aims and productivity schemes, etc. So I'm not familiar with the African context of subsidies and government support. But where do you see your results actually changing specific policies?
Yeah, thanks. That's a really good question, and we've probably not gone at the moment, not as far as we'd well, no, it's not quite true. At the moment, I'm not sure. And what we've planned at the moment is that we had, through our task forces, in-country task forces, people that were sufficiently connected to policy to kind of get their inputs on the modelling, as we said, and to prime them for the results, for when the results are out, and to have those pathways into policy there. So it was a long-winded way of saying that through our partners FANRAPAN, we've got task forces and people that are connected to do that part of it. But I'm saying that in a very hand-wavy way, right? But I'm at the end of the day, I'm a trained physicist and crop climate modeler, and so maybe I'm allowed to wave my hands around in that way and say, well, that we've been building the links for that to happen. But the other thing to say is that we have had policy dialogues throughout, where, for example, we would get a request: do we want to talk to the South African Parliament at a meeting in a couple of weeks' time as part of their thinking on policy development? And we said yes, and we had a meeting, and I think it was productive, but it's then difficult to trace that down into specific changes that happen further down the line. I don't know if anyone, Stuart or Helen, I don't know if you've got more specific things to say about that.
I was going to give a very simple, specific example about the Zambian oilseed diversification strategy, just to give a clear and simple example where, so the crop yield projections in this case fed into a report that was about oilseed diversification and what crops could be sensible to grow in Zambia. So in this case, our projection showed, for example, that diversification into soybean is probably a good idea, given that the yield projections for soybean are more optimistic than maize, which currently dominates obviously many countries in sub-Saharan Africa. So that's a clear example of feeding into kind of government policy decisions. But I think the most important point is, as Andy said, that we're sort of currently working with our partners via FANRAPAN to deliver policy outcomes once the results are kind of written up and developed. And we're currently in the process of summarizing all of this information that I've just sort of talked about, just in terms of the modeling outcomes. But there's a lot of information that still needs to be summarized and the key points drawn out, I think.
Can I just clarify my question? So first, I think the example you gave is a good example of putting science into policymakers' hands, but it's similar like to CCC reports in the UK. It is not a policy by itself. It's a document that feeds into the policy process. A policy will be changing the productivity scheme and adding diversification into it, as an example. But I wanted to ask, if in retrospect, my experience, for example, with my BestMap project, we started thinking about the policy from the start. From writing the grant application, we were thinking about specific policies, because that's how European funding is quite tied to policy. If you had started the whole thing again, would you have thought more about what policy you want to influence when you design the research?
If we could have identified specific policies at the start of the work, then yes, absolutely. I mean, that's not, it's not at all my area. But if indeed, Guy, in a future project, if someone could work with me to and work together to identify those specific policies and then target the work towards that, and thinking about the policies, the implementation, as Fiona mentioned, and the ways in which they can be a barrier or an enabler, perhaps. These would be really interesting questions to think about at the proposal design stage, actually. So let's do it. This is another part of that idea, I think, where we can build on this and do something like that in the future. And that'd be really good if we could have that clarity at the start. That would be fantastic. Yeah. Marcelo, you have your hand up.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to corroborate, I think, the point that she raised around China. I think that's really impossible to ignore China as a key player in this whole discussion. And I heard that from our Malawian partners when I went there as well. And we could see actually things happening in a lot of investment, not only in agriculture, but focusing on agriculture, that's quite relevant how it's changing kind of the priorities for land use, as like thinking about commodities, the pressure for commodities, and it's more than land use. So it's water resources to grow crops, it's sunshine. So yes, it's a really important aspect, but also geopolitics. So it's basically also winning hearts and minds and kind of developing assistance and so on. So it's a really complex issue, but very dynamic. So I think like tools like iFEED potentially could evolve or expand into being kind of more nimble or flexible to kind of reflect quicker changes, like this, like what's happening now, obviously. Yeah, so that's a really important component, I think, of the whole picture there. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, absolutely, Marcelo. Thanks. And certainly that land use framing has been important in AfriCap and in iFEED. But I think connecting that to the policies would be the real, because then we're really getting specific, and we're not talking about national level policies that set out ambitions. We're talking about different parts of the country and what to do where, and that would enable us to then get into answering those questions specifically.
Yeah, I think Fiona mentioned, well, soya, right? So we're working on a proposal on that. And so what happens in China is quite important in terms of expansion of soya areas and so on, because of an increased demand for livestock products, by the population in China. So that affects Africa quite a bit as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Fantastic. Wow. So this has been great. I mean, I've written loads of notes and feel like there are enough ideas for 4 more proposals actually that really do join things up kind of end to end, or perhaps it's not too late for the current ones, in fact. So I'm just reading the last couple of comments. So yeah, land use reform, trade agreements are a really important part of that. Chiyu, yeah, I agree. Are there any, so we're about 12 minutes away from the next breakout starting. So let's give everyone ensure we all have a break to get up and walk around our gardens or campus or wherever we are. But are there any final comments or questions before I wrap up?
Just to say that, thanks to Chi, the article you shared is really interesting. Actually, it disproves some of the misconceptions I had about Chinese engagement in Africa, and how it seems like there is much more investment in creating markets for Chinese companies there than land grabbing and importing food from China from Africa to China. But that raises a question to you, Andy. I mean, is there worries that dominance of China in perhaps inputs and advice to African farmers will slow down any kind of green transition in Africa? I don't know if you can relate to this.
Well, I've not read. I clicked on the link, but I've not read the article. Could you just join the dots briefly there as to how that mechanism would work?
Well, I mean, that article is saying that there's a lot of the Chinese investment in Africa is, opening the market for rice seeds from China to be planted there, or investment in infrastructure or providing advice to farmers. So if the Chinese become a significant force in advising, farmers, I don't know if you've looked at advice. It's a topic that is very important in UK agriculture and European agriculture advice. And if we are, the Western advice kind of sphere is trying to do things like regenerative agriculture, sustainability, etc. And that might be different than what an advisor coming from China will advise African farmers how to do agriculture. So I don't know if that increasing engagement from China might be slowing down African transition to more sustainable agriculture in 10 years, 15 years time?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know the answer to that. That's an interesting point you raise. And what it suggests to me more than anything is the importance of opening up some dialogues at the academic level, at least, which is something we can do, maybe relatively simply, on exactly these issues and on just more exchange of information and of ideas, just to look at how these different interventions might play out. But, my own view would be that to focus on, to focus on a kind of reasonably sized chunk of the problem and a reasonably sized chunk of kind of people, if you like, and to sort of build outwards from that. But I think some dialogues, what you're saying would suggest some dialogues with Chinese academics at the very least to kind of look into that. It's interesting. So we've only got a few. We're going to officially be cut off, I think, in about 3 or 4 minutes. Steve, I can see your hands up.
I was just going to say in response to your point, Sky, that we have good work with China on regenerative approaches to agriculture, and our partners there are really strong in this area, and they're very interested in what we do with Africa, more from the point of view just of, they're interested both from an academic and an impact sense about how different parts of the world can farm better in that general sense, including things like environmental outcomes and social outcomes. That's one point. So I think we do have partners in place that could engage exactly on this topic, as Andy had suggested. And that's just my personal connections. There are many others, both in the group here and broader in the university, that would offer that. And the other thing is that I think also for economic development in the region and the UK generally post-Brexit, to me, government policy, industrial strategy is so much around product development. And this seems to be echoed in the points that you just made from this article that she provided around the importance of products and trying to get people to have our products, find new products that can penetrate the market. Certainly in the area that we're talking about here, and wow, Stuart, you just gave us this kind of tour de force with your talk and then the conversations here. What we do have is the capability to create a really strong and positive services industry, in my view. So I come from the environmental engineering background, and the UK has such strong and really good, and I think they've done a lot of positive work around, things like designing environmental protection schemes, designing and contracting and building methods to clean up the environment, things like that. And I think we could do that kind of knowledge service industry around these areas that not like we're trying to penetrate a specific market somewhere, but that in all these partnerships that we have, be it in China, be it in Africa, be it North America, or wherever, that's something I think we could do really well. That's
a good point, Steve. Thanks. And I mean, well, notwithstanding, as Marcelo notes, the ODA cuts in the UK, but there are other ways. There's EU, there's CDIAR. We are counting down, about 30 seconds. So I shall wrap up in less than that, really, by just saying thank you to everyone for a really interesting discussion. I'll be honest, I've got far more out of this than I expected. And so I really appreciate your input. Feel free to get in touch and follow up. I think there might be some more official channels for this that Sarah will instigate. I don't know, but don't necessarily wait for that. Just get in touch if you want to follow up on any of these things. I've certainly got some notes to type up. So thank you all very much for your engagement in this session. Stuart, any